Today at Speedy's Garage, we're going to love on Project 4Runner a little bit. It's been a while, so those of you new to my YouTube channel probably haven't seen the video where we installed the TRD supercharger. We did that about 10 years ago on this 2002 4Runner, and it really woke up the performance as you would expect. It came with a 7 PSI pulley. We upgraded to the Underdog Racing Development 2.2 pulley, which took us to about 9 PSI of boost. And at the same time, we installed the Underdog Racing Development piggyback controller and 7th injector. This allowed me to tune the vehicle a little bit, remove some timing down low to prevent detonation, as well as add additional fuel through the 7th injector there in the back to give us a little bit more fueling and a little bit more power. It's run great like this for almost 10 years, but I decided I would go ahead and try to up the horsepower a little bit, and we've got some tricks up our sleeve to do that. Also, what I've noticed when driving on the freeway, and when you really start getting into the throttle, the first hard pull feels really strong. It's got a lot of power, a lot of torque, but if you get on it again after that, the heat is built up so much that you start to lose a little bit of timing. I've got a scan gauge hooked up, and initial pulls will be 12 or 14 degrees of timing, and then the second pull will be 11 degrees, and it'll drop down to 9 or even 7 degrees at times, and you can really feel the power drop off in the vehicle. And the reason this happens is due to heat. The TRD supercharger for the 3.4 liter Toyota motor is a non-intercooled supercharger. What that means is the air comes into the supercharger, it's compressed in the supercharger and immediately pushed into the engine directly. There is no intercooler in between the supercharger and the engine cylinders. So the hot air from the supercharger, as it's compressed, goes straight into the cylinders. For those of you pretty familiar with superchargers and how they work, you can skip forward a little bit. For those that aren't, keep watching. The TRD supercharger on the 4Runner is what they call a non-intercooled supercharger. What that means is as the intake air comes into the supercharger, it is compressed, which generates quite a bit of heat, and the hot air goes straight into the engine. That's why the more you boost the engine, so you keep going wide open throttle over and over and over, it keeps boosting that air and heating it up. The hotter this gets, it just keeps getting the air hotter as well. Goes straight into the motor senses that change, you start getting some detonation, it starts pulling timing, as it should to protect the engine, but you lose power. More modern superchargers, or a lot of them, have what's called an intercooler and a heat exchanger. So you got the intake air coming in, it gets compressed in the supercharger and heated up just like a non-intercooled. However, you have this extra layer. It looks like a radiator, exactly what it looks like, just a small thick radiator a lot of times. And as the air blows across it, there's a pump circulating coolant. So you've got coolant flowing around in a loop. Blows through the intercooler, or flows through the intercooler I should say. It picks up the heat that has been generated by the supercharger. It takes that heat to the front of the vehicle where there's a heat exchanger. As you're driving, and the faster you go, the faster the air blows across the heat exchanger. It cools this fluid, and the cool fluid flows back to the intercooler again to pick up even more heat. And it just makes a big loop like this, and so you get much cooler air going into the engine. The way water methanol injection works is in situations where you don't have an intercooler, intake air comes in, the injection nozzle is in the intake tube usually, a few inches from the throttle body. It sprays, the mixture goes into the supercharger, so you get a little cooling effect here. It goes into the cylinders, and this is where the magic really happens. The methanol actually has an octane rating of about 110 to 115. So you get a huge bump in your octane over 91 or 93 octane. So that's already good for the motor as is. But also, as the fluid enters the hot cylinders, it changes state. It goes from a liquid to a gas. And when that occurs, it absorbs the heat in the cylinders, so it cools your intake air, or your exhaust gas temperatures, I should say, and it makes the engine, with the extra octane, you got the cooler intake coming in, plus the heat being pulled out from the fluid change, you get a whole lot more horsepower. So cool charge, more octane, more power, which is what we all want. Water meth comes in, changes state from liquid to gas in the cylinders, absorbing heat as I said. So that's why it's going to work so well on the TRD supercharger, because it basically replaces this whole system with just a chemical that sprays in the intake. So to fix that, we've gone with a cooling mist stage 2 meth injection kit. Comes with the controller, and this is the reason I actually chose the cooling mist system. I like the way this controller is set up. It's got a min and a max knob, so you can set it up to what PSI it comes on, and then it'll progressively add meth injection to the max PSI, and then you're at 100% flow. Comes with the tubing, the pump, Comes with a couple of wires, some fittings. This stuff is junk, I won't even be using that. 4 screws to put the pump on the vehicle, which I'm gonna end up using my own hardware to mount. Things that didn't come with that I'm gonna add are the self-healing tank tap. I actually got that from Devil's Own water meth injection. You drill a hole in the washer reservoir, which is what I intend to use, and then you tighten that down and it will seal the hole, and that's how you'll get your fluid. I'm planning to run the standard winter washer fluid. Some people say not to use that because of the detergents, but I've read that as long as you shake it up and the bubbles go away immediately, that it's fine. So I'm gonna try it and see how we do. Obviously I'm gonna add some wire loom. I like my wire colors to always match up, so I added the necessary wire colors that I would need, as well as some bolts to mount the solenoid that came with the cooling mist kit. Tools are gonna be pretty standard stuff. The only unique one that I'm gonna need is this step bit, and that's to make the hole in the washer reservoir. You need a 7/8 bit to make that happen. Obviously gonna use power tools wherever I can to save time. You're gonna need standard stuff for all the electrical, from heat shrink, wire stripper, electrical tape, solder, and soldering iron. And you're also gonna need a good assortment of sockets and wrenches. And maybe some interior trim tools as well. To get an idea where I'm gonna mount the pump, I've started by removing the splash shields. And those are just held on with 9 12mm bolts. Next, I'm gonna remove the front grille, and it's just these little plastic tabs you push down on with a screwdriver and you release all of them. Mine's a custom grill that I built, so yours might be different, but bottom line, just go ahead and get that out of the way. Next, we're gonna remove the front bumper, and it's a couple of 14mm bolts on each side, and a couple of 12mm bolts for the plastic shroud on the front. And be sure you disconnect your fog lights and your front turn signal if you have fog lights in the bumper. The final piece of the puzzle to get the front bumper cover off is this stud right here. It's got a 12mm flat washer bolt on it, and they go through these grommets on each side. Once you remove that nut, you just have to wiggle the bumper off, and it takes a little bit of muscle. Next, I remove the plastic guard over the washer bottle, and it comes out through the passenger side wheel well. There's 2 10mm bolts, one on the top, one on the side, and mine were in pretty rough shape. And then there's a couple of hooks where it actually hooks onto the washer bottle itself. So there's the 2 bolts. Then you come up top and you pop the neck loose, and it pops loose from this tab. And then it wiggles out, and we should be able to get the washer bottle out through the bottom. I found one more 10mm bolt on the front towards the bumper. We'll need to remove that. Next, disconnect the front and back supply tubes. And finally, your electrical connections to your motors, and then it will come free. And this larger 4-connection connector is the one you want to release, and then that tab right there goes to the connector that's actually on the bottle, and then the whole reservoir will come off. Okay, we're starting to get a few parts off the car now, so you want to start organizing your bolts with the parts they go to, so you'll know what went where when you put it back together. So next, I mocked up where to put the pump and the solenoid, and thanks to Texas Ace over on Yotatech Forum for recommending this location. It's just about perfect. On this 2002 4Runner, there's a big open space behind the bumper right here, and so it fit great. Fluid will come from the bottom of the reservoir into the pump here, out of the pump here, into the solenoid there, up, and through that hole right there to get into the engine bay. Very clean, everything's close together, and the inlet of the pump is below the reservoir, which is what I wanted. To mount the solenoid, there are 2 threaded ports on the back of this one. And I think I said they were 8-32, and I used 1/2-inch little Phillips head screws, and I picked up some aluminum spacers to space it away from the body of the truck to get it a little bit more in line with the output of the pump. That should make routing the line a little nicer, and it won't rub against the body. It's the little details that make things last. That's why I always do stuff like that. Next, I've located a spot to mount the Devil's Own self-healing tank tap. Like I said, this is one of those that as you tighten it down, the rubber expands, creating the seal. And looking at the very bottom of the tank, there's a spot right there that looks like it was almost made for that tank tap. And looking inside the tank, you can see that that spot's nice and smooth. So what you want is a nice smooth area that's flat to mount that tank tap, since it's at the very bottom of the tank. The fluid will just exit, come straight out and towards the pump. Should work great. I'm going to use my center punch to mark a start hole. Now we're just going to drill it out. So that step bit does a nice job of making a perfect circle. Nice and clean. I did go in with some 400 grit sandpaper and just smooth that edge so it wasn't sharp. And now our tank tap, we'll just drop in and we'll finger tighten it, and that's what we'll have. And again, if you use the same tank tap that I used, that's a 7/8 hole. That's the size you're going to need. Next, I filled it up with water to test for leaks. All it took was finger tight to seal it up. To get the lines to route nicely, I went and picked up some 90-degree elbows. I wasn't able to find the exact size that I need. These are 3/16, and I believe I need an 1/8 size. So what I did is just took one and modified it. I cut the barb off of it because it wouldn't slide over that barb, or I was afraid if it did, it would split the line. So I just cut the barb off, and that's super tight. There's no way that's ever coming out. And that's going to help me route the lines a little more cleanly coming out of the reservoir and over to the solenoid. And if you want to do something like I did, there's the part number for the pack that I found. There's 2 of those small barbs, or small 90-degree elbows in this pack. So depending on how many you need, but it's 47355 is the part number. Or you can just try to order some 1/8" barbs off of the internet somewhere. I didn't have time to wait, so I just made my own. So I've mocked up my lines to see how they're going to run. There's my elbow I talked about earlier, coming out of the tank tap. Comes around to the front, connects to the pump, out of the pump, up to the solenoid, and over, you can see that, and around into the engine bay. From there, I route it under the air box and along the wall of the fender and around to the intake tube where the nozzle will be located. And obviously this is just mock-up. I will put wire loom over that to protect it and to hide it and make it all pretty. I also filled the tank up about 1/4 of the way with water to check for any leaks. I've let it set for about a half hour and not a drop. I did make sure I've got some in the tube, so I know we're good to go there. So everything's turning out nice so far. So as I mentioned, I use a circuit boss for my aftermarket accessories. So I've removed the floor trim as well as the kick panel so I can get access to it. And basically it's an add-on fuse block. It has switch 12-volt power, a relay, and then that powers 3 additional circuits, and they're kept independent from the car's wiring. So all of my accessories run through that. And I've got one line available, or one circuit available that I'm going to use for the meth injection. Now I'm going to prep to run my wiring through that large grommet. This isn't the only way to do it, this is just how I do it. You can actually drill a fresh hole if you wanted to, or go through some other grommet in the firewall. I found that one to be pretty accessible from the inside of the vehicle. And I've obviously run a lot of stuff through it, so it's a little tight, but these wires won't be too much additional. And I'm going to use a coat hanger or some long rod to feed the wire through. Next, I'm going to remove the glove box to give me access to that wire as it comes through. And that's just a couple of Phillips head screws on the very bottom. And then the glove box will just lift out. Next, I'm going to remove the AC duct It's really easy. Push it to the driver's side. It'll pop out. Now we can get access to the wiring. I think that'll be good enough for me to get the wires in. We will have to take some parts of the dash out to get to the gauges. Next, to get a 4-wheel drive 4Runner, loosen this Phillips head screw for the 4-wheel drive knob. You don't have to take it all the way out, just loosen it so that it'll slide off the stick. Then you just gently pry up on the bezel. And I went ahead and removed the shifter lockout so that I could put it in different positions. And then just lift that up. And then the 4-wheel drive shift button has a connector down here that you need to disconnect. And then we're going to work on this. For the center console, there's really not a whole lot to it. Make sure you got the shifter back all the way, and it's just tabs. You just pop loose, and then a whole bunch of plugs. There's a hazard plug, there's plugs for these. These have to be disconnected, the ashtray light, and the cigarette lighter. And this of course assumes you're going to mount your boost gauge or your water meth controller where my boost gauge is now. You can always mount it over there in the corner or somewhere else in the vehicle. A lot of people put them down here in this opening, but I've built a custom panel. If you haven't seen that, it's on my website, speedysgarage.net, to hold all of my gauges. So I'm just going to replace my boost gauge with the controller. And when you get the bezel removed, that's what you're left with. And this is the same procedure, by the way, if you're going to upgrade your stereo. Same exact thing. Next, I'm going to have to take these 4 screws out to take out my custom cluster that I built with the stereo and integrated. Back in the day when I built this custom gauge bracket, I used butt connectors or spade connectors so that I could do service, make it serviceable. I could disconnect everything if I needed to. The only thing I have left is the boost gauge. I need to disconnect the actual vacuum line, and this is what will feed our meth controller. If I were building this today, I probably would do a nice Molex connector for all of these. So I've got several connections, the wideband, dimmer for the gauges, as well as power and ground for the gauges and things like that. I'd probably just do a giant Molex connector so it was one big connector that snaps together. I've learned about that since I built this 10 years ago, and it's basically pins that you solder to the wires and then they snap into a plastic Molex and they just snap together. It's really nice and OEM looking. So I ran into just a little bit of a wrinkle. I built a custom gauge pack to mount my gauges on top of my stereo, and the water methanol controller and boost gauge is a different size than the autometer boost gauge I had been using before. So that means I'm going to have to make some adjustments to these brackets. Also, I had a Nord's cog gauge to read wideband from my Innovate LC1 wideband controller, and it's been on the fritz. It would freeze up and I'd have to tap it to make it start reading again. So while I had everything apart, I decided to replace it with an Innovate DB gauge, I think is what they call this. And I'm running the same issue there. The back is actually totally different, as you can see. This one had studs, this one doesn't. So I'm gonna have to make new brackets to make all of that work. And I don't know if you've seen these before, but I actually made little trim rings, and these are made from 2-inch conduit, if I remember correctly. And I cut them at 10-degree angles so that they would actually make the gauges face towards the driver. So I have to take the angle into account too. So it's gonna take a few minutes to fix, but nothing I can't get done with a little bit of 1/2-inch aluminum bar stock. So I'll be back in a few minutes. And when you're working on cars, especially anything where you've got something custom made, you've got to be ready for this kind of stuff and just basically roll with the punches and make it all work. So no big deal. So this is what I came up with. If you're asking if I upgraded the stereo at the same time, yes I did. One of them with Bluetooth and Pandora and some of the other features. So went ahead and swapped out the stereo for the new one, but that doesn't change what I had to do. The brackets and everything are still exactly the same. What I did have to change was this bracket across the back. I actually simplified it some, so now that's just 2 pieces. This one runs out, down, and all the way over. And you can see how I routed it. I had the clearance for the boost tube right here. No big deal, a little bit of Dremel work. Really not technically difficult, just a lot of measuring, rechecking, because this is all real intricate fitting pieces. So you have to make sure that they look nice and even, equidistant, and all that kind of stuff. But that's how I got it done. Now we can get back to installing the kit. One thing I gotta mention, the cooling mist controller did not come with any bracketry or hardware. I went and searched the box. I was kind of surprised at that. So I had to make a bracket, which wasn't a big deal. I probably would have had to make one anyway. But then I had to search through my bucket of spare bolts just to find these little lock nuts to go on the back. So keep that in mind if you're buying this kit. You want to go ahead and get your hardware to save you some time when you're installing it. Next, I'm going to go ahead and put the wires that need to run to the interior together. I measured off plenty of length to reach, and I'm putting them in this fabric loom. I like to use this stuff. It makes the wiring a lot nicer, protects it, makes it look OEM. And to put it on, you just inch it. So once you get it started, you just slide a little bit and pull a little bit. And eventually, your wires pop out the other end. That's what you end up with. I put some electrical tape over the end and I loop the wire over and put it on a clothes hanger, cut off clothes hanger. We're going to use that to feed the wire through our grommet back there. And if it gives you any trouble, just remove the little bracket on the right side. It's a 10mm bolt here. Help stuck it back in so I didn't lose it. There's two 10mm bolts here, and then you can pull it off the firewall to kind of get some assistance putting that wire through. Mine's pretty full. It's pretty packed full of other stuff, so mine was pretty tricky. Now we can put that back on. We've got the wire run to the inside. And don't forget to finish it off with a little bit of heat shrink to make it look professional. Okay, I've installed loom on the injection tube, and in the engine bay I use the high temp stuff. And you know it's high temp because it has a gray stripe on it. And this is a quarter inch loom, and it fit the tubing perfectly. Ran it all the way around, like I said, routed it down out the front of the car into the solenoid. I got the pump hooked up as well as the elbow to the washer reservoir. I also finished off the loom, so it runs here like I showed you before, and then where the fiber loom stops, I started with the corrugated stuff, and I have soldered in the 15 amp fuse that goes to the power side of the pump itself. So that's soldered into the red wire that will run back to the cooling mist controller. Then I zip tied it to keep it secure and serviceable if I ever need to change the fuse. I put the fuse in. And this one has a waterproof cap that goes over it like that. Much better than the one that came with the kit. I don't recommend those splice-in design fuse holders. They're crap. Don't use them. So when soldering, always use proper solder technique, and that is to heat the wire, not the solder. When the wire is hot enough, it should draw the solder into the wire. So you can see how it's drawing the solder into the wire, almost like it's just painting it. That's what you want. And that's what you end up with a properly soldered joint. Now we're going to put our heat shrink on and get it all protected by loom. A lot of people are probably tempted to use butt connectors on something like that. If you have to, at least use the weatherproof ones where you put them on and then you heat up the ends and they shrink together. But on something like this, you want a very solid connection, and when you solder something, it basically just becomes one piece of wire. So I recommend soldering it and not using any type of butt connector. Just like that, nice and tidy.